Welcome, my dear family. Before we begin our spooky journey tonight, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who enjoys bedtime scares. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is, so leave a comment below and cheer me up a bit on YouTube. Now, relax, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's story. Story 1. I was a Colorado wildlife officer. What I found near an abandoned ranger cabin still feels impossible. I worked for Colorado Parks and Wildlife for almost 11 years. Most people hear that and picture postcard stuff. Elk moving through aspens at sunrise, clear streams, little kids holding up their first trout for a photo while their dads grin behind them. And sure, some days were like that. Some days were quiet. Some days I spent more time explaining fishing regulations to tourists from Denver than doing anything dangerous. But the backcountry is a different country. Once you get far enough from pavement, once the trailheads thin out and the cell service dies, and the nearest porch light is half a county away, people stop behaving like people in town. They get meaner, stranger. Some get desperate. Some get territorial. Some live so far off the grid they barely remember the world you came from. And then there are the ones that don't want to be remembered at all. This happened in September of 1998. Up in the San Juan Mountains, west of Creed, in a stretch of rough country most hikers avoided after the first week of hunting season. Officially, I was up there checking reports of illegal gill netting in a protected cutthroat spawning basin. Unofficially, I'd also been told to keep an eye out for a camp no one could seem to locate. Twice. Different reports described it differently. A tarp shelter, a line shack, a hunting camp with no tags, no permits, and no truck visible anywhere near it. One man swore he'd seen smoke coming from a chimney halfway up a ridge where no marked structure existed on Forest Service maps. Another claimed he found a deer carcass hanging from a lodgepole pine, with the head missing and the organs laid out in a neat half circle under it. A deputy out of Hinsdale County laughed when he told me that part, said hunters tell ghost stories every year. Then he added, quieter, that he'd once answered a call up there in winter and found a snowshoe track that looked like it had been made with pieces of tire bolted to wood. He said that like it was a joke. It stayed with me anyway. I was 34 then, divorced, sleeping badly, drinking more diner coffee than blood. I drove an old state-issued F250 with a cracked dash and a radio that only worked when you smacked it with the heel of your hand. I carried a sidearm, a 12-gauge in the truck rack, bear spray, cuffs, maps, and enough confidence to get myself into places I should have backed away from. That Monday morning, I topped off the tank in South Fork, grabbed a breakfast burrito wrapped in foil from a Sinclair station, and headed west before daylight had fully burned off the low fog in the valleys. By the time I hit the forest road, the sky was pale and hard and blue, cold enough that my breath smoked a little when I stepped out to unlock the gate. The aspens had just started to go. Yellow flashed through the dark timber like old fire. Beautiful country. The kind that tricks you into thinking nothing bad belongs there. My truck made it 8 miles before I had to park at a washed-out spur and continue on foot. The ranger cabin I had been authorized to use sat another 6 miles in, near a small, unnamed creek feeding into a larger drainage. It was old, but still listed in a maintenance inventory from the early 90s. 1 room, tin roof, wood stove, shutters on 1 window. Government green paint peeling off the door in hand-sized scales. It was supposed to be a temporary base while I checked the lake, creek mouths, and a series of game trails poachers liked to use as shortcuts. I signed the trail register at the old board by the trailhead and noticed I was the only name in 3 days. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made the woods seem bigger. The hike in was uneventful for the first 2 hours. Chipmunks in the deadfall, gray jays trailing me for food. One set of mule deer tracks pressed sharp into a muddy patch near the creek crossing. Around mile 4, I started seeing older sign. Snare wire tucked in brush, an ash circle from a cold fire, beer cans flattened and shoved under a log. Not recent, but not ancient either. Then I found a fish head. It was lying in the middle of the trail like it had been placed there. Not a trout, bigger, long jaw, pale flesh turning gray at the edges. One dead eye staring up through a halo of flies. The body was nowhere around, just the head, severed clean behind the gills. I crouched and looked closer. There were cuts along the cheek that didn't look like knife work, more like scraping. The flesh was ragged in narrow, parallel strips. I remember thinking a scavenger might have dragged it there. What bothered me was how centered it was, perfectly centered, right on the trail. I stepped around it and kept moving. I reached the cabin shortly after 1 in the afternoon. It looked worse than the maintenance note suggested. The roof sagged over one corner, and the stovepipe leaned a few degrees too far east. One shutter hung crooked off a rusted hinge. The door was closed but not latched. I called out before entering. No answer. Inside smelled like old soot, mouse droppings, damp wood, and something underneath that I couldn't place at first. Sweet and rotten, not strong, just there, faint as a memory. The main room held a bunk frame with no mattress, a narrow table, a split wooden chair, and a cast iron stove with a nest built in the firebox. Somebody had left a cracked enamel mug on the windowsill and a stack of outdated hunting pamphlets in one corner. I checked the back wall and floorboards, half expecting signs of squatters, but found nothing recent. Still, the place felt watched. I know that sounds dramatic. I hate when people say that because it usually means nothing. But there's a real difference between being alone and feeling observed. Alone feels empty. This didn't. This felt occupied by absence, like someone had just stepped out the moment my boots hit the porch. I set my pack down, did a perimeter, checked the creek, and found something that made me pause. Tracks. Not boot tracks, not quite. They were longer than a normal boot print and narrower through the waist. The tread wasn't made of any standard sole pattern I knew. It looked almost hand-cut. 2 shallow grooves running lengthwise with little crossbars between them. I'd seen improvised sandals before, homemade snowshoes, weird hunting modifications, but these had a deliberate symmetry to them. There were 2 sets. They came out of the timber behind the cabin, circled the structure once, and stopped at the porch. Not on the porch, at it, like whoever made them stood there for a while, facing the door. Then both sets moved uphill into the trees. I followed them, maybe 30 yards before the ground hardened under a quilt of pine needles, and I lost them. On the slope above the cabin sat a flat rock outcrop overlooking the roof, the door, and the creek approach. A natural blind. There were cigarette butts there, not old enough to crumble. One had lipstick on it, dark and dried almost black. I looked around a long time after that. No voices, no movement, just wind in the spruce and water below. I radioed in a status check from the highest rise I could find. Static swallowed most of it, but dispatch got enough to know I was on site. I almost mentioned the tracks, then didn't. I had no crime yet, just trespass sign in public land, nothing worth sounding jumpy over. By late afternoon, I headed out to begin the actual survey. The basin lay another 1.5 miles north, through mixed timber, marshy ground, and granite shelves where the creek widened into pools. I saw no illegal nets, no bait buckets, no fresh can. I did find a line of cutthroat in the shallows, flashing under clear water like dropped silverware. And I remember thinking how normal that was, how easy it would be, in country like that, to talk yourself out of anything strange. On the way back, near dusk, I finally met someone. He stood beside the creek under a leaning pine, half hidden behind brush, a fishing pole in one hand. I didn't hear him approach. One moment the bank was empty, the next he was just there. He wore a brown coat too heavy for the season, canvas pants patched at both knees, and a brimmed felt hat stained darker around the crown with sweat or grease. He was old, maybe 60, maybe older, in the way hard living makes it impossible to tell. His beard came in uneven gray clumps, and one of his eyes drifted slightly outward when he looked at me. "Evening," I called. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past me, toward the ridge where the cabin sat. Then he said, "You sleepin' in that state house?" His voice had that mountain flattening to it. Old local accent rubbed thin and made stranger by years without conversation. "I am tonight," I said. Wildlife check. He stared at the rod in his hand as if he'd forgotten he was holding it. "You by yourself?" That set my teeth on edge a little. "Why?" He shrugged. "Just asks." I moved closer, enough to see his line had no hook on it. "Got some reports of illegal fishing up here," I said. "You got ID on you?" He smiled then, but only with the lower half of his face. "Ain't fish you ought to be worrying over." I asked his name. He ignored that. Instead, he lifted his chin toward the timber and said, "You hear whistling after dark. Don't answer it." I waited for the punchline. There wasn't one. "Sir," I said, "if you're camping in this drainage, I need to know where." He stepped backward into the brush. That old, drifting eye fixed on me in a way that felt suddenly precise. "You should leave that porch a gift before sundown," he said. "Something with grease in it, something they can smell." "Who's they?" He gave a tiny shake of the head. "Don't name what listens." And then he turned and walked into the trees. I followed him 10 seconds later and found nobody. No snapping branches, no movement downhill, no boot sign I could immediately pick up on the rocky bank. It was like he'd gone through a slit in the woods and the slit had closed behind him. I stood there longer than I want to admit, feeling stupid, annoyed, and more unsettled than I should have been. By the time I got back to the cabin, the light was going blue. I told myself the old man was either a drunk, a squatter trying to scare me off, or somebody mentally unwell. Rural Colorado had no shortage of all three. I built a small fire outside, heated a can of chili on my camp stove, and logged what I'd found in a field notebook under the beam of my flashlight. At some point while eating, I noticed the woods had gone quiet. Not night quiet, dead quiet. No insect buzz, no squirrel chatter, no splash from the creek. Even the wind seemed to be moving without sound. Then, something knocked once from beneath the cabin. Not loud, just a hard wooden tock directly under the floor. I froze with the spoon halfway to my mouth. A second later came another. Same spot, same force. I stood slowly, flashlight in one hand, chili can in the other, like an idiot. "Hello?" I called. Nothing. I set the food down and walked to the side of the cabin where the crawl space opening should have been. There wasn't much of one, just a gap between the lowest support log and the earth, screened partly by brush and a sheet of warped tin someone had leaned there years before. I pushed the tin aside with my boot. The beam of my flashlight found dirt, stone, old wasp nests, and a scatter of animal bones. Tiny ones at first, rabbit probably, maybe marmot. Then farther back, half buried in the dirt, something bigger. A deer skull. Only it wasn't laid there by nature. It had been cleaned. Not professionally, but by hand, or teeth, or time, in a deliberate place. Next to it sat 3 vertebrae threaded onto a length of baling wire, like beads. I backed away from the opening and felt the muscles in my shoulders tighten. Somebody had been under there. I went inside, shut the door, slid the bolt, and checked the window latch. The cabin had no phone and no generator, just my radio, which only worked from higher ground, and my sidearm, which suddenly felt less like equipment and more like a fragile idea. That sweet, rotten smell in the cabin was stronger now that the night cooled. I found where it was coming from around 9. The bunk frame had been pushed slightly away from the wall, probably by me earlier, without noticing. Behind it, tucked in the dark gap between the wall boards and the log chinking, hung a bundle tied with faded blue twine. At first, I thought it was dried herbs or an old insulation wad. Then my flashlight caught teeth. I wish I were exaggerating. Small teeth, animal, I think, set in shriveled gums, stitched together with hair and strips of hide into a kind of charm or fetish. Around them were bird bones, fish spines, and what looked horribly like finger bones, until I forced myself to study them harder and decided they were raccoon. The whole thing had been nailed to the wall at eye level behind the bunk, where nobody staying there casually would see it. In the center of the bundle was a patch of hide with something burned into it, a circle. Inside the circle, a shape like a cabin roof over a line. I cut it down with my knife and took it outside without touching more than I had to. I threw it into the fire, where it crackled, blackened, and released a smell so foul I nearly gagged. Wet hair, rot, sweetness gone wrong. That was the first moment I considered abandoning the survey and hiking out in the dark. I actually packed half my gear before I stopped. The trail down that ridge was rough in daylight. In full dark with no moon under timber, it would be stupid. One bad step, one turned ankle, one wrong fork, and I'd be spending the night injured in the woods anyway. And if there really were squatters or poachers out there, moving blind on a trail while advertising my location with a flashlight might put me in even worse shape. So I stayed. That decision still lives in me like shrapnel. Around 10:30, I heard footsteps on the porch. Clear as speech, slow, measured. One board creaked, then another. I drew my pistol and killed the lantern. The cabin dropped into darkness, broken only by the stove's dim orange seam and thin moonlight around the shutters. The footsteps stopped at the door. No knock, just breathing on the other side. Not loud breathing, not animal, human and patient, through a nose that sounded partly blocked. I moved to the left of the door frame and waited. After maybe 15 seconds, something brushed softly against the wood. A fingertip, dragging downward. Then came a whisper through the gap under the door. Left nothing. My mouth went dry. It was not the old fisherman's voice. This voice was younger, rougher, like somebody who didn't use much language and liked it that way. I didn't answer. A long pause followed. Then from the window on my right came 3 light taps. I turned so fast I almost fired. Nothing but shutter slats and darkness beyond them. Then another whisper, this one from farther away. You got one in there with you? I stayed silent, heart hammering hard enough to shake the sight picture in my hands. A third voice answered from somewhere near the trees. Smell to. The words went through me cold. I was alone in that cabin. I knew I was alone, and yet, for one dislocated second, hearing that, I almost turned around to check behind me. That was the effect they had. Like they wanted your own senses to mutiny. Something slid through the rusted mail slot in the door. I flinched, gun rising. It was a strip of hide, no, cloth. It landed on the floorboards with a wet sound. Even before I touched it, I could see it was dark with blood, fresh enough to still glisten. Pinned to it with a sharpened fish rib was a clump of blonde hair, matted with scalp. I stared at it so long my mind stopped functioning normally. Then a woman laughed outside, not a big cackle, just a short, private laugh that said she knew exactly what picture had just been placed in my head. I shouted then. I identified myself. Colorado Parks and Wildlife, armed officer, ordered them off state property, told them I would shoot anyone attempting entry. Silence answered. Then from uphill, above the cabin, came a whistle. 3 rising notes. From downhill, near the creek, another whistle answered. Then another, farther off in the trees to the east. They were triangulating, or pretending to. It worked either way. I backed to the far side of the room, where I could watch the door and window together. I remember noticing ridiculous details then. The little halo of rust around the stove bolts, the way one floorboard had split clean at the grain, the pulse pounding visibly in the hand holding my pistol. Fear does that. It makes the world too sharp. The first impact hit the wall around midnight. Something heavy slammed into the cabin hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. I nearly fired again. A second impact hit the shutter. A third struck the roof and rolled. Rocks, I realized. They were throwing rocks. Maybe to test me. Maybe to keep me awake. Maybe to cover movement. I heard one voice murmur close to the wall. Then a fingernail, or claw, it sounded like a claw, scraped slowly across the boards from one end of the cabin to the other. Then something began moving beneath the floor again, not knocking now, crawling. The soil under the cabin made a dry rubbing sound as knees or elbows pushed through it. A body shifting under me, directly under me, so close I could feel the vibration in the soles of my boots. It paused beneath the center of the room, and then a face looked up through a knothole in the floor. I saw it because a coal shifted in the stove and briefly brightened the room. An eye, just an eye first, round and glistening in that hole between the boards. Then pale skin pressed up under it, lips peeled back from teeth in a silent grin, dirt ground into every crease. I fired once into the floor. The face vanished. A scream erupted from under the cabin, high, not male, not fully female either, followed by furious thrashing in the dirt.
Something banged against the support posts. Someone outside shouted, footsteps scattered. The smell that came up through the floorboards then was unbelievable. Blood, wet earth, old piss, and a sour, infected odor, like a bandage peeled off a wound that should have been treated a month ago. I moved without thinking, grabbed the lantern, kicked open the stove, and shoved in more wood for light. That may have saved my life, because the moment the room brightened, a hand shot through the mail slot. Not a whole arm, just the hand and wrist, reaching, clawing blindly for the bolt. The skin looked wrong, scarred and glossy in patches, as if burned long ago and healed badly. The fingernails were thick, yellow, cracked. A ring finger was missing, the stump smooth and old. I brought the pistol down on that hand with everything I had. Bone popped. Whoever owned it shrieked and yanked back so fast the mail slot snapped upward and banged against the door. At the same moment, the window glass exploded inward. I threw myself sideways as a dark object came through, an iron spike or sharpened tool tied to rawhide. It struck the far wall and stuck there, quivering. Then one of the shutters tore open, and a face appeared in the gap. I will see that face until I die. It belonged to a woman, or had once. Long, wet hair hanging in strings. One cheek split open from mouth to ear, either scarred that way or freshly torn, I couldn't tell. Teeth visible through the side of the face when she smiled. Her nose flattened, crooked, like it had been broken many times. And her eyes were bright with the kind of delighted hunger I've only ever seen in predators. She hissed when she saw me, actually hissed. Then she shoved something through the broken glass. A child's sneaker, tiny, mud-caked, with red-brown stains soaked through the fabric near the toe. I fired. The shot blew splinters from the frame and sent her backward out of sight. I heard her hit the ground, then cursing and laughing at the same time. More movement outside. Fast. Coordinated. That was when I understood the cabin was no defense at all. It was a box. One they knew better than I did. I had 6 rounds left in the magazine, a spare mag in my vest, and no illusion now that this was just harassment. They meant to get in, or burn me out, or wait for dawn and take me in the open. I needed distance and terrain I could move through. The back wall of the cabin faced the creek, with a narrow slope dropping through brush to the watercourse and then rising into thicker timber. No door there, but the boards near the rear corner had a section half rotted through at the bottom. I'd noticed it earlier and dismissed it. Now I went to work on it with my boot and the butt of the pistol. Outside, they seemed to realize what I was doing almost immediately. The whistling started again, louder, urgent. Something slammed into the door from outside. Once, twice. Wood cracked. I kicked through the rotten boards just enough to make a jagged opening near the floor. Cold night air hit my face. I dropped my pack through, then my flashlight, then flattened and squeezed out after them, scraping my back raw on splinters. The ground behind the cabin was all mud, roots, and deadfall. I belly crawled the first few feet, expecting hands to seize my ankles any second. They didn't. A shout came from the front of the cabin, then another. "They gone!" I ran. Not heroically, not in a straight line. I crashed downhill through black timber like an animal with its ass on fire, slipping, catching myself, branches whipping my face, pistol clenched so tight my hand cramped. The creak noise grew louder ahead. Behind me, I heard at least 4 people moving, maybe more. Not yelling much now. They didn't need to. They were used to moving in that dark. I wasn't. I hit the creek harder than intended and almost went face first into the water. It was mountain cold, snow melt cold, and the shock of it nearly took my breath away. I crossed without caring about noise, boots plunging between stones, then scrambled up the far bank on hands and knees. A light flickered through the trees behind me, lantern light. Then another, lower, warmer glow. Torches. I wish I were inventing that. I wish I could tell you they used flashlights like everybody else. But what I saw between the trunks was open flame, moving with bodies. They wanted me to see them coming. I cut uphill, aiming for a rock field I'd passed earlier, near the basin trail. If I could reach open granite, their tracking advantage narrowed. That was the thought, anyway. The truth is, most of my brain had collapsed to a few primitive commands. Move. Listen. Don't fall. Don't let them touch you. I almost let them. About 15 minutes into that run, I heard breathing directly to my left and turned the flashlight in time to catch a shape charging between trees. A man, thin, shirtless despite the cold, chest cross-hatched with white scar tissue. He wore some kind of crude footwear strapped with rawhide, and in his hand was a hatchet so old the head looked hand-forged. His mouth opened as he came, showing missing front teeth black at the roots. I fired twice. The first shot missed. The second hit him somewhere high in the torso or shoulder. I know because he spun and dropped the hatchet, but he did not go down clean the way movies teach you a man should. He folded against a tree, made a sound like air leaking from a punctured tire, then started crawling after the hatchet with pure, stubborn purpose. I left him there. The rock field came into view a few minutes later, pale under starlight. I gained it on bleeding legs and lungs that felt lined with fire. The granite opened above timberline into broken shelves and house-sized boulders. Wind moved freer there. So did sound. I dropped behind one slab and killed my light. For maybe 30 seconds, I heard nothing except my own ragged breathing. Then, from below, a voice floated up. Not shouted, spoken conversationally. "He's cutting left," another answered. "No, he minds the stone." They could read me in the dark. I eased the spare magazine in, trying not to let the slide click too loud. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A child crying. Close. Too close. Thin, hitching sobs from somewhere behind the next boulder over. Every nerve in me seized. It was a little girl's cry by the sound of it. 7, 8 years old maybe? Terrified, trying to stay quiet and failing.
It came again, followed by a whisper. Please. If I'd been a different man, or a younger one, or just a little more tired, maybe that works. But even in that moment, half mad with fear, one part of me noticed something impossible. No child would be barefoot up there in that cold, crying that steadily without shivering gasps or movement. No child ended sobbing that neatly and restarted on cue from the exact same distance. I stayed where I was. The crying continued for another 10 seconds. Then it stopped all at once. A minute later, I heard somebody scuttle over the far side of the boulder where I would have gone if I'd taken the bait. I waited until I had a silhouette and fired once. A scream answered, then anger, real anger this time, several voices at once. They'd lost the game face. I used that moment to break uphill again. By then the eastern horizon was barely beginning to pale, not enough to see by, just enough to separate ridgelines from sky. I knew if I kept west-northwest, I'd eventually intersect an old Forest Service road cut shown on my topo, not maintained, but passable on foot. The problem was getting there before they either cornered me or shot me. Because yes, they had guns too. The first round cracked over my head just after I entered another timber belt below the ridge. Not a modern rifle crack exactly, more of a heavier boom with a slight lagging echo. The shot hit a trunk ahead and showered bark into my face. Muzzleloader, I thought wildly, remembering the deputy's joke and hating how much I didn't want it to be true. A second shot came from farther right a minute later and smashed into deadfall at knee height. They were hurting me. I cut downhill instead, taking a route so steep I half slid it, grabbing saplings to keep from breaking my neck. At the bottom I found a game trail and then, by pure luck or grace, the rusted outline of an old cattle gate hanging crooked between posts. Road cut. I ran along it in darkness, tripping in washouts, while the sky slowly lifted from black to iron gray. Behind me, the noises changed, less stealth now, more rushing. They knew daylight would expose them too. At one bend in the road, I looked back and saw them clearly for the first time. 5 figures, maybe 6, spread across the trees 50 yards back. One carried a lantern. One limped badly. One, God help me, was the woman from the window, her face a pale slash in the dawn. They were dressed in layers that didn't belong to one period. Old hunting coats, patched sweaters, army surplus, hides, denim gone white with age. And on their feet, several wore those handmade soles cut from tires. One of them had something hanging from his belt that swung as he ran. At first I thought it was a canteen, then the light caught it. A human jawbone. Maybe a trophy, maybe a tool, I don't know. It knocked against his thigh as casually as keys. I fired twice to keep distance and kept moving. The road cut finally met graded gravel just after sunrise. Real county road. Washboarded, narrow but drivable. I stumbled onto it so exhausted I almost laughed. Then I heard an engine. A ranch truck appeared around the bend coming east. Old Chevy, primer on the fender, horse trailer hitch rattling behind it. I ran into the middle of the road, waving both arms with the pistol down at my side. The driver hit the brakes hard enough to fishtail. I must have looked insane, mud to the waist, blood on my face from branches, shirt torn open, eyes wild. He cracked the door, took one look at the gun, and started cursing at me.
I shouted badge first, name second, help third. He saw something in my face and let me in. The moment the passenger door slammed, I turned to look back down the road. Nobody. The trees stood still in fresh daylight, innocent as a calendar picture. The driver asked who was after me. I said, "Drive." He drove. We made it to a ranger substation outside Lake City, where I gave the first statement of about 10 I'd end up giving over the next month. Sheriff's deputies, state investigators, internal review, all of it. They photographed my injuries, collected shell casings from my sidearm, sent teams back to the cabin. Here is what they found.
Blood under the cabin and beside the window. Human. More than one source. The front door damaged around the lock and mail slot. The sharpened iron spike embedded in the wall. Tracks, lots of them, but partial and muddied by the responding teams before anything useful could be cast well. In the crawl space they found bones, not human officially, mostly deer, elk, raccoon, beaver, a few too degraded to identify with confidence. They also found, behind a support post I hadn't seen in the dark, a pile of objects wrapped in hide and cloth. Fish skeletons, braided hair, old coins, a rusted deputy's badge from the 1950s, a child's plastic barrette, and 3 Polaroids fused together by moisture. One of those photos separated enough to view. It showed the cabin porch in winter. On the porch stood a man wearing what looked like a ranger coat from decades earlier. His throat was open, not cut, open, torn so deeply the white of the spine showed behind black blood. Snow beneath him was dark and churned. In the corner of the photo, almost out of frame, someone was smiling at the camera with half a face. No bodies were found in the woods. No camp either, at least none my superiors were willing to put in writing. Just old fire pits, snare remnants, and signs of intermittent habitation in terrain so broken a team could search 3 days and miss 100 things. The official report settled on violent squatters or feral poachers. Unofficially, nobody wanted the case. No agency likes a story that sounds insane and proves nothing cleanly. I was cleared on the shooting, returned to duty after mandatory psych evaluation and leave. I transferred districts the following spring. That should have been the end. It wasn't. 6 months later, in April, I got a padded envelope with no return address at my apartment in Montrose. Inside was one thing: a strip of cured hide folded around a fish hook made from bone. Burned into the hide was the same symbol I'd seen on that charm behind the bunk. Cabin roof over a line. There was also a smell trapped inside the package, faint but unmistakable. Sweet and rotten. I threw it away. A week later, I found it back on the passenger seat of my truck. Maybe someone was messing with me. Maybe somebody in evidence had crossed a line. Maybe I was already losing parts of myself by then. I burned it in a barrel behind the shop and watched until it became powder. That night, I woke to whistling outside my apartment window. 3 rising notes. I lived on the 2nd floor. When I finally forced myself to look between the blinds, there was nobody in the alley. Just something on the sill. A wet footprint, no longer than my hand, ribbed with the pattern of a tire. I quit wildlife work 3 years after that. Told people the divorce, the hours, the stress all caught up with me. That was part of it. The bigger part was simpler. I no longer trusted remote quiet, couldn't sleep in cabins, couldn't hear creek water after dark without checking windows 3 times and keeping a gun close enough to touch. Every once in a while, someone will mention an old story from the San Juans. Missing hiker, hunting camp found empty, livestock remains arranged wrong, whistling heard where nobody should be. I never join those conversations, but I listen. And twice in 28 years, I've heard a detail that turned my blood cold. The first was from a deputy's son who swore his dad once found a deer skeleton wired together under an abandoned porch like a charm. The second came from a lineman working outage repair in rough country north of Creede. He said his crew discovered an old one-room structure while cutting through timber after a storm. Might have been a line shack, might have been a trapper's cabin, hard to tell. He and another guy went inside to get out of the rain. He said the place smelled awful. Said there was a rotten bunk against one wall and a little pile of bones tied up with blue string behind it. And he said, nailed above the door, from the inside, was a strip of wood carved with words so old and chewed up he could barely read them. He took a picture before the crew chief made him leave it alone. He showed me that picture in a diner in Gunnison because he knew I used to work the backcountry and thought I might find it interesting. I kept my face straight while he handed over the phone. The carving was crude, deep, and done with a knife sharpened poorly enough to tear the grain. But I could read it. I read it the way you read something in a dream and know before you know. It said, if they take the gift, do not stay the night. Below that, nearly lost in the wood's cracks, was a second line, smaller, as if the person who carved it had been weaker by then. If you hear them crying, it is already too late. I gave the phone back and told the lineman he should probably forget the place. He laughed and asked why. I almost told him. Instead, I paid my check, left cash on the table, and walked out into the parking lot where the evening was cooling down and the mountains were turning purple in the distance. For a moment, with the wind moving through the cottonwoods behind the diner, I thought I heard it again. That whistle, 3 rising notes. I stood very still. There are things in this country that survive by being dismissed, by sounding too ugly, too backward, too impossible to fit into paperwork or polite conversation. People hear a story and file it under folklore, meth heads, mountain weirdos, whatever helps them sleep. Maybe that's what they are. Maybe they're just people gone so wrong and so far from the rest of us that their habits started looking like ritual. Maybe all the bones and charms and bait cries and old weapons are just the natural endpoint of isolation plus cruelty plus time. I'd love to believe that. I really would. But there's one part I never put in any report because I knew once I said it out loud, I'd hear how it sounded. When that eye looked up at me through the knothole in the floor, just before I shot through the boards, I saw recognition in it. Not curiosity, not rage. Recognition. Like it knew me. Like it had seen me coming long before I ever signed that trail register. And sometimes, when I wake before dawn for no reason and the room is perfectly silent, I can still smell that cabin. Damp wood, cold ash, rot, sweet enough to taste. Then I lie there in the dark, not moving, not breathing too loudly, and listen for something scraping softly at the door, something patient, something that knows exactly what lives inside. Story 2. The man who hired me to fix his cabin wanted someone to die inside it. I used to tell people I had one of the best jobs in Northern California. That was before I started wondering if I'd been hand-picked for murder. Back then, if someone asked what I did, I'd keep it simple. I restored old cabins, mostly vacation places tucked back in the woods, log homes with failing roofs, busted stoves, mouse-chewed insulation, rotten decks, water tanks full of rust flakes, and 20 years of dust in every crack. Realtors liked me because I worked fast. Out-of-state buyers liked me because I could take a place from barely habitable to weekend ready in under 2 weeks, if the structure itself wasn't too far gone. I'd spent enough nights alone in cabins to stop noticing the usual noises. Roof pops when the temperature drops, pine branches scratching a window, coyotes raising hell somewhere down in the drainage, raccoons under the floor, squirrels in the eaves. I carried a pump shotgun in the truck, an old Maglite, a toolbox heavy enough to kill a man, and the kind of confidence that only comes from years of nothing happening. That's probably why I took the job without asking more questions. This was in October of 2016, up in the far northern end of the state, beyond the kind of places tourists think of when they picture California. No beaches, no palms, just long county roads, black timber, old logging country, gas stations with mounted deer heads on the wall, and diners where everybody looks up when the door opens. The first call came on a Thursday morning while I was replacing a cracked stovepipe collar outside Redding. Unknown number, male voice, older, calm, almost flat. He said he'd gotten my name from a realtor in Wairika, that he'd recently bought a cabin northeast of Mount Shasta and needed someone to clean it out, patch it up, and make sure it was livable before the first real snow. His name, he said, was Walter Bell. Even now, I don't know if that was true. He spoke in a careful, measured way, like every sentence had been practiced once before he said it out loud. Not rehearsed exactly, more like selected. He told me the property sat off a Forest Service road past an old fire break, about 40 minutes from the nearest paved highway, if you knew where to turn. The cabin hadn't been used regularly in years. The former owner had died. His heirs dumped it cheap. He had no interest in doing the work himself, but he wanted it fixed before hunting season traffic made the area busy. That part rang true. I'd done plenty of those. Family cabin gets inherited, nobody wants to maintain it, somebody cashes out, new owner hires a guy like me to make it clean enough for listing photos or a winter getaway. I asked him the usual questions. Running water? Septic? Power? Any roof leaks he knew of? Rodent problem? Structural damage? He answered all of them, just well enough to be useful and not well enough to be specific. Power from a generator shed. Gravity-fed water tank may be contaminated. Wood stove worked last time anyone checked. 1 bedroom, loft, little porch, tool shed, no nearby neighbors. Then he asked if I was comfortable sleeping on site. I told him that was normal for me. There was a pause after that, not long, but it registered. Then he said, "Good." That should have been nothing. For years I replayed the way he said it. Good. Not relieved, not grateful, certain. He wanted to meet in person before giving me the address. Said he preferred to put cash in a man's hand if that man was going to be alone on his property for days. He suggested a diner outside Weed, off I-5, near a Sinclair station with a cracked fiberglass dinosaur by the road.
I drove up the next afternoon. The weather had turned that specific cold Northern California gets in fall, where the sky looks scrubbed clean and every shadow feels sharper than it should. Mount Shasta sat out to the east like a giant white tooth above the trees. I remember that because I was in a decent mood, listening to old country on the radio, coffee in the cup holder, thinking it'd be another straightforward job before the snow line came down. The diner was half empty. Local ranchers, a couple of Caltrans guys, and Orange, a waitress who called everyone honey whether she liked them or not. I spotted him right away because he was the only one seated with his back to the wall and sunglasses still on indoors. That, more than anything, is what I remember first. Not the hat, not the jawline, not his clothes, the sunglasses. They were too dark for inside, big, squared-off things that covered half his face. He wore a faded navy windbreaker zipped to the throat and a tan ball cap pulled low. Mid-60s, maybe. Lean. Hands like old fence wire. Not soft, not delicate, but oddly clean. He stood when I approached and offered his hand. I shook it. He didn't let go. Not aggressively. That would have been simpler. He just held on a beat too long while looking at my face like he was trying to match me against something only he could see. I gave a little tug, polite but clear. He released me and smiled. "You work alone?" he asked. "Most of the time." "No partner? No helper?" "No." He nodded once, as if confirming a detail. We sat. He ordered black coffee and didn't touch it. He slid an envelope across the table before I even finished asking to see photos of the cabin. Inside was cash. $200 bills and a stack of 50s. More than enough for a deposit. I looked up and said I usually invoiced through bank transfer or check. "I prefer cash," he said. "Lot of it to carry around." He gave the smallest shrug. "I've never trusted anything I can't burn." It was a strange answer, but not crazy enough by itself. I've met plenty of eccentric landowners in rural counties. Gold bugs, tax weirdos, old anti-government types, men who still spoke about the 80s like federal agents were in the trees. We talked specifics. He unfolded a county map and marked the turnoff with a pen that had no company name on it. Forest Service Road 42N17. Stay on that until the second cattle guard. Then take a narrow dirt road south where the old logging slash piles used to be. If I reached the washed-out culvert, I'd gone too far. He also gave me a brass key on a plain ring. No house key, no car key. Just one long brass key. When I asked why he wasn't going up there with me to walk the property, he said his knees weren't what they used to be. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "If anybody asks, you're there working for yourself." I laughed, thinking he meant trespassers or nosy locals. He didn't laugh back. I should have stood up right then. Instead, I took the envelope, the key, the map, and drove home with a job on the books for Monday. That weekend, I loaded my truck the way I always did. Generator oil, bottled water, spare propane, extension cords, hand tools, hardware bins, duct tape, contractor bags, bleach, rat traps, a shop vacuum, fresh bedding, canned food, shotgun shells, and enough coffee to make the dead ambitious. I also threw in a small pry bar, which ended up mattering more than anything else I packed. Monday morning, I headed north before sunrise. was. I fueled up in Mount Shasta, grabbed breakfast at a Chevron, and drove east on a state route that dwindled into two-lane county road, then narrower pavement, then graded dirt. The radio faded to static after the last town. Cell service died 10 miles later.
By the time I reached the first cattle guard, my truck was coated gray with road dust, and I'd seen exactly 2 other vehicles, a battered Ford hauling firewood and a sheriff's Tahoe heading the opposite direction. The turnoff was easy to miss, just a scar through manzanita and lodgepole where old tire ruts disappeared into trees. If Bell hadn't marked it on the map, I'd have driven right past. The road got worse fast. Ruts deep as graves, branches scraping both sides of the truck. At one point, I had to stop and drag a fallen limb out of the way. Another mile in, I passed the blackened remains of an old gate post and a mailbox nailed to a stump with no box attached, just the rusted door hanging open like a metal tongue. No posted signs, no address marker, nothing that said people belonged out there. I found the cabin just after noon. It sat in a shallow bowl of trees on the far side of a clearing that looked half reclaimed by the forest. Tall sugar pines, fir, deadfall. An old split-rail fence collapsed into gray ribs. The cabin itself was bigger than I expected, but rougher too. 1 story plus loft, hand-hewn logs, green metal roof, front porch sinking on the left side, smoke-black stains around the chimney, and a generator shed about 40 yards off under a stand of cedars. No other structures nearby. No fresh tire tracks besides mine. No human sound at all. If you do enough rural work, you learn there are different kinds of solitude. Some places feel empty in a peaceful way. Others feel vacated. This place felt the second way, not abandoned exactly. More like people had stopped using it suddenly, and the air hadn't caught up yet. I parked facing out, which was a habit of mine. If I needed to leave in a hurry, I didn't want to waste time backing up around stumps and rock. I took the key, climbed the porch, and opened the front door. The smell hit me first. Mold, old wood smoke, rodent piss, and beneath that something sweet and stale I couldn't identify. Not strong, just wrong enough to make me pause. The interior was dim, even at midday. Curtains drawn, dust everywhere. A sagging couch, stone fireplace full of bird nests. Kitchen counter with dead flies and a rusted coffee pot. 1 bedroom off the main room, tiny bathroom, ladder to the loft. Exactly the kind of place I'd cleaned up 100 times. And yet, the disorder was strange. Not random neglect, interrupted use. There were canned beans in a pantry with expiration dates only 2 years old. A folded blanket draped over one arm of the couch with a thick layer of dust on top, as if someone had thrown it there and never came back. In the sink was an enamel mug with a dark ring dried into the bottom. A pair of men's rubber boots by the door, stiff with age but not chewed by mice. I did a full walkthrough. Bedroom, old mattress, mouse droppings, 1 dresser drawer half open. Bathroom, no running water, iron stains in the bowl, cracked mirror. Loft, 2 cots, 1 broken lantern, a stack of hunting magazines from 2011 and 2012. Nothing alarming. Still, the whole place felt staged by absence. Like if someone had told me the owner had stepped outside for wood and never returned, I'd have believed it. I got to work because work settles nerves.
I opened windows, swept, bagged trash, hauled out rotten curtains, bleached the counters, checked the stovepipe, pulled a dead squirrel skeleton from under the sink, found a box of 30-30 shells in a kitchen drawer with no rifle nearby, found a shoe under the bed with no mate. By 3 o'clock, I had made enough progress that the place looked salvageable. That was when I noticed the first camera. It was zip-tied to a tree about 25 yards north of the porch, chest height, angled toward the cabin. Trail cam. Not unusual on rural land.
People use them for deer movement, trespassers, bears getting into feeders, all kinds of things. What was odd was how new it looked. Clean lens, fresh housing, no fading. I walked out to it, expecting maybe a security setup from the previous owner. Then I saw a second one, and a third. I eventually found 6, all of them mounted in a loose ring around the clearing, all aimed inward at the cabin, not outward toward the approach road. That made me stop. Security cameras watch what comes towards something. These were watching the cabin itself. I stood there under the pines, looking from one to the next, and felt the first clean slice of unease. Maybe Bell had put them up after purchase. Maybe he wanted to monitor wildlife near the structure. Maybe he was paranoid. Rural property owners get weird about theft. But why not tell me? Why not mention there were half a dozen cameras trained on the place where I'd be sleeping? I tried his number then. Disconnected, not rang out, not voicemail. Disconnected. I remember the exact automated voice because I heard it 3 times in a row while standing in that clearing, with wind moving the branches overhead. This number is no longer in service. That was the moment the job shifted in my head from odd to bad. Not proof bad, just wrong bad. I looked around again, slower this time, at the old fence, the clearing, the shed, the dark tree line beyond. No movement, no engines, no one. I told myself the simplest explanation was still most likely. Maybe he'd switched phones. Maybe the cameras belonged to the seller. Maybe I was spooking myself because the place was remote and too quiet. So I kept working. People always imagine bad situations begin with a dramatic turning point, a scream, a blood stain, a body. Usually, they begin with you deciding not to trust your first instinct. By late afternoon, I'd cleaned enough to sleep inside if I chose to, but I still planned to use the truck for the first night. That was routine on jobs where I wanted to keep one clean room untouched until the final day. I hauled out a heap of ruined bedding and old magazines, stacked salvageable firewood under the porch, and finally headed to the generator shed to see what kind of shape it was in. The shed door stuck from swelling. I had to shoulder it twice before it opened. Inside, along with the generator and 2 red gas cans, there was a smell so bad it made my eyes water. Not fuel, rot. I lifted the flashlight and swept the beam across the cramped interior. Shovels, a splitting maul, mouse nests, chains, a rusted fuel funnel. Then, in the back corner, under a blue tarp, something long enough to be a rolled rug. I already knew it wasn't. There are shapes the body recognizes before the mind wants to. I stood very still for a second, hearing my own breathing inside that tiny shed.
Then I used the tip of the maul handle to lift the tarp. At first, all I saw was denim. Then, bone.
A leg from the knee down, still in a rotting pair of jeans and a work boot, detached cleanly enough at the joint that the white end of the femur showed through wet black tissue like split chalk. The flesh that remained had gone greenish-brown and collapsed inward around the bone. Maggots pulsed in the creases like the thing was still thinking. The tarp slid farther. There was more underneath. Not a full body. Parts. The other leg, stripped badly. A hand with 2 fingers missing. Sections of ribs hacked loose and caved in. A skull with most of the lower jaw gone and the upper teeth exposed in a permanent horsey grin. Tufts of hair still stuck to the scalp at the back, gray and dirty with dried blood. There are certain smells you never lose once they enter you. That one lives behind my nose to this day. I stumbled out of the shed, gagging so hard, bile hit the dirt. The first sane thought I had was sheriff. The second was no service. The third was get in the truck and leave right now. That was the one I should have obeyed immediately. Instead, I did what people who want certainty often do when certainty can still kill them. I spent another minute trying to understand. I walked back to the cabin and grabbed my shotgun from behind the seat. Then I checked the house a second time, fast and armed. Because if somebody had butchered a man and hidden him in the shed, I needed to know whether they were still on the property. I found nothing inside except one new detail I somehow hadn't noticed before. On the kitchen wall, beside the pantry door, half hidden behind a hanging cast iron pan, someone had driven 3 nails in a vertical line. From those nails hung small objects on fishing line. A deer ear, a dried clump of feathers, and what looked like a human tooth. I stared at it for about 3 seconds, then backed away and went outside. By then, it was getting late enough that the light had started to flatten under the trees. I got in the truck, locked the doors, and turned the key. The engine clicked once. Nothing else. I sat there, confused. Battery was fine that morning. No hint of trouble. I tried again. Click. I popped the hood. The battery cable had been cut. Not frayed, not chewed, cut clean through. I still remember the exact feeling that moved through me then. Not panic first. Offense. A hot, disbelieving fury that somebody had done this while I was working 50 yards away and I hadn't heard a thing. Then panic came. I grabbed the mag light and checked under the truck, around the tires, into the tree line, my head swinging so fast I gave myself a cramp. The clearing was empty. But now it wasn't just empty, it was occupied by intention. Whoever cut that cable had already been close enough to touch my truck. Maybe they were close enough now to touch me. I took stock. No phone signal, no truck. Dusk coming. Nearest highway at least an hour by vehicle. Much longer on foot through roads I didn't know well. I had a shotgun, shells, flashlight, water, food, tools. And somewhere on that property, either recently or not, a man had been hacked apart. There was one possible advantage left to me. Light. If I stayed alert, kept the cabin bright, and used the dark outside against whoever was out there, maybe I could make it till morning and get out on foot at first light. Not ideal, but workable. So that became the plan. I moved fast,
hauled my supplies inside, shut every curtain, checked every window latch, propped a heavy dresser in front of the bedroom window, and stacked split wood near the front door in case I needed kindling or a weapon. Brought the pry bar within reach, loaded the shotgun, put the mag light on the table, dug out a spare headlamp from my gear bin. Then I did something I'm still not sure was smart or stupid.
I pulled the memory cards from 2 of the trail cams closest to the porch. If nothing else, I wanted evidence. Inside, I found an old laptop inverter in my truck kit that let me power my beat-up work laptop off a battery pack. It took me 15 sweating minutes to get one of the cards to read. When it finally did, I opened the most recent video file and nearly shut the machine again because my hands were shaking too badly to use the trackpad. The footage was black and white night vision. The cabin sat in center frame under moonlight. Timestamp: 2 nights earlier. At first, nothing happened. Then, from the trees, a man walked into view, carrying a lantern. Not Walter Bell. This man was taller, broader, beard down to his chest, one side of his face covered in what looked like burn scar tissue, shiny in the infrared. He stood near the porch and looked toward the camera, not at the cabin, like he knew where the camera was. Then another figure joined him. Then another. 4 total. All men, as far as I could tell. One dragged something heavy from off camera. At first, I thought it was a deer carcass. Then the lantern lifted, and I saw the shape lurch over the dirt. Human. Wrapped in a tarp, maybe, or blanket, but with an arm hanging out. The men hauled it to the porch. The video had no sound, which somehow made it worse. No voices, no exertion, just these silent men moving with awful familiarity around the cabin, like stagehands preparing a set. One of them turned and looked directly into the lens. Then he smiled. The video ended there. I checked the next clip. Same view, same cabin, same night. The men were gone. A minute later, the front door of the cabin opened and somebody stepped out onto the porch. Even in grainy infrared, I recognized the outline instantly. Ball cap, windbreaker, sunglasses, still on at night. Walter Bell stood on the porch of the cabin he claimed his knees kept him from visiting. He looked into the darkness for a long moment, then crouched and placed something on the top porch step. After that, he straightened, turned, and went back inside. The clip ended. I don't remember deciding to stop watching. I just remember suddenly being aware of the room around me again, and how dark the windows had become. The cabin had swallowed the evening while I was staring at those files. And outside, somewhere beyond the glass, were men who had carried at least one body to that porch, while the man who hired me watched. I checked the front step through a slit in the curtain. There was something there, a shape no bigger than a shoebox. I hadn't heard anyone approach. I hadn't heard anything at all. I waited until the last natural light died. Then I took the shotgun, killed the inside lamp, opened the door fast, leaned low, and hooked the object with the pry bar back into the cabin before slamming the door shut again. It was a cardboard pastry box, white once, grease-stained now. I touched it with the bar and the lid shifted open. Inside was a human ear sitting on butcher paper. Fresh, not rotten like the remains in the shed. Fresh enough that blood still shone in the folds. There was also a note folded beneath it. I used the pry bar tip to to flip the note open. 3 words written in blocky black marker. Stay inside tonight. I wish I could tell you I handled that calmly. I didn't. I backed up so fast I banged into the table hard enough to tip the laptop. My stomach rolled, my mouth filled with that metallic spit right before vomiting. I came close, but the note did one useful thing. It clarified the situation. This was no longer a maybe. No maybe the cameras belonged to someone else. No maybe Belle was eccentric. No maybe the cut cable was random sabotage by local junkies. Whoever had put that ear on the step knew I was in the cabin, knew I'd see it, and wanted me alive until night. That meant the danger had a schedule, and if something has a schedule, you can try to get ahead of it. I made a second plan. I would not stay in the cabin if I could help it. But I also wouldn't leave blind, on foot, without knowing whether there were vehicles, roads, or people positioned out there to intercept me. The best chance I had was to create the appearance of staying put while preparing another escape route. So I went to work. I stripped the clean mattress off the bed and laid it on the floor in front of the couch, stuffing pillows under a blanket to look like a sleeping body in low light. I left one lamp on near the bedroom, enough to cast a warm glow through the gaps in the curtains. Then I quietly pried loose the panel beneath the kitchen sink where the plumbing passed through the exterior wall. Behind it was just enough rotted wood and crawl space clearance to squeeze through if I had to. I moved water, shells, flashlight, and the truck battery pack near that point. I also found a hatchet in the woodpile outside earlier and brought it in as a backup. For the next 2 hours, nothing happened. That was the worst part, the waiting. Every small noise becomes a decision point. Branch snap, wind or boot, scratch on the roof, squirrel or hand. You start manufacturing danger faster than the real thing can arrive. At some point around 10, I forced myself to watch more of the trail cam footage because ignorance wasn't helping. On another clip from the night before, Belle stood on the porch again, facing outward. After a few seconds, he reached up and tapped the porch light fixture 3 times with something metal. Then he stepped back. 30 seconds later, figures came out of the tree line, not fast, not sneaking, like guests arriving at an appointed hour. There were 5 that time. 1 woman among them, I think, thin and long-limbed, hair hanging in ropes. She carried something dangling from one hand. The men gathered at the base of the steps, looking up at Belle. He seemed to say something. Then he pointed toward the cabin. The camera caught one of the men tilting his head in a way that made my skin crawl. It was almost playful. The video cut again. Whatever happened after that never got saved, or Belle had removed those cards himself. I stared at the screen until my eyes hurt. Then came the first knock, not from the front door, from the bedroom window. 3 slow taps. I turned off the laptop instantly. The lamp still glowed warm by the fake bedroll in the other room. The rest of the cabin sat in a brown half-dark full of sharp corners. Another 3 taps. Then silence. Then a voice right outside the wall said, very softly, "You can come out. Fire's not set yet." My entire body locked. Male voice, middle-aged maybe, calm, almost conversational. I didn't answer.
From farther off, maybe near the porch, another voice said, "Don't spook him, he'll bolt."
A woman laughed. The sound was low and intimate, like they were all standing around a grill in somebody's yard, making jokes I wasn't part of. I crouched by the kitchen wall, shotgun up, and waited. Something dragged across the porch boards. Then the doorknob turned. Slowly. Stopped. Turned again. The lock held. A few seconds later, someone knocked politely. I nearly fired through the door just from the sound. That's how wrong it was. Not pounding, not frantic, just a soft house guest knock in the middle of nowhere from people who'd left a severed ear on my step. "Mr. Keller?" a voice called. That froze me harder than anything else had. Keller, my last name. Belle had never written it on the map or envelope where I saw. I hadn't told anyone up there who I was. The voice came again. "Mr. Keller, your truck won't start." I heard chuckling after that, several people trying not to laugh. Then the porch boards creaked under shifting weight. I moved the safety off. "Go away," I shouted. "Sheriff's already been notified. First man through that door gets shot." There was a pause. Then, from the far side of the cabin, near the shed, a man shouted back, "Sheriff won't come before the smell does." More laughter. The window beside the sink exploded inward. Not glass break first, the screen tore. Then a hand came through and grabbed for the curtain rod. I fired on reflex. The shotgun blast in that confined space was deafening, bright enough to blind me for half a second. Someone screamed outside. Not a fake scream, a full-throated, pain-shocked howl. At the same moment, footsteps thundered off the porch and around the walls. They'd been testing. Now they knew I'd shoot. I backed into the bathroom doorway to narrow angles and reloaded with shaking fingers. Outside, the wounded person kept making a wet, bubbling noise that told me I'd hit them hard, maybe in the forearm or face. Then another voice, colder now, called through the damaged window. "You shouldn't have done that." Something struck the cabin wall, then another impact, and another. The smell hit a second later. Gasoline. They were sloshing it against the logs. I moved before my brain fully caught up, grabbed the battery pack, flashlight, spare shells, pry bar, kicked the sink panel free the rest of the way. The first flame blossomed orange outside the bedroom window. I saw it through a slit in the curtain, climbing fast where fuel had caught on dry wood and old cobwebs. They hadn't come to drag me out. They were going to smoke me, burn me, or both. I dropped flat and shoved my gear through the opening under the sink, then pushed myself after it into the crawl space dirt. Nails tore my jacket, something sharp peeled skin off my shoulder blade. I barely felt any of it. Behind me, the cabin changed sound. Fire has a sound before it has a roar, a kind of eager eating. Dry wood taking heat. I belly crawled into cold dirt and cobwebs and dead leaves, hearing voices above and outside all around me. One said, "Watch the back." Another answered, "He won't take that hole, too mean." I went still. They knew about the crawl space exit. Of course they did. If Belle or the others had used the cabin before, they knew every weak point it had. Smoke began rolling under the floorboards almost at once, thick and oily. Staying meant choking. Going out meant maybe into their hands. I chose movement. I wriggled deeper beneath the cabin, keeping the shotgun parallel to my body,
and found that the space widened toward the far rear corner. There, half blocked by roots and stone, was an older opening under the foundation logs, big enough for a man to force through. I killed the flashlight and listened. Voices on the left side, crackling fire to the right. No footsteps directly behind.
I slid out into the dark and found myself under the porch shadow at the back corner of the cabin, shielded for the moment by smoke and the angle of the blaze. Orange light pulsed over the clearing. Men moved through it as silhouettes carrying cans. One stood by my truck with what looked like a rifle. Another limped near the bedroom side, clutching an arm wrapped in something dark. I ran for the trees. Somebody saw me almost immediately. There! Then chaos. Shouting, branches slapping. A gunshot cracking past my right shoulder hard enough to make the air twitch. I veered downhill instead of toward the road, because the road was obvious, and obvious gets you killed first. The ground dropped into a gully, choked with brush and deadfall. I crashed through it, half sliding, hearing them behind me no more than 20 or 30 yards back. They moved faster than I expected, familiar with the terrain, not stumbling much. At the bottom of the gully, I found a narrow trail. Maybe old game track, or maybe something they used regularly, because it curved around blowdown with just enough logic to be human. I took it anyway because random thrashing through timber would only slow me. That was a mistake. The trail ended at a ravine. Not a sheer cliff, but steep enough, rocky enough, and tangled with brush enough to break a leg if I tried it blind. I stopped hard, turned to backtrack, and a shape rushed me from the side. We hit the ground together. It was a man, all stink and breath and flannel and corded muscle. One of his hands was slick with blood, maybe his, maybe not, and the other had a length of chain wrapped around it. He didn't say anything at first, just grunted and tried to get the chain around my throat. I jammed the shotgun between us, sideways, and bit his wrist because I had no better option. He screamed into my face. I smelled rot in his teeth. Then I brought my forehead into his nose with everything I had. Something crunched. He lurched back. I got one hand on the hatchet tucked in my belt and swung from the ground. I didn't hit where I meant to. I was aiming shoulder. The blade went into his lower jaw just left of center. Not deep, maybe an inch or two, but enough. I'll never forget the sensation. Not a clean chop, a stuck, meaty bite, followed by his scream turning into a thick, gargling spray across my face. He rolled off me, thrashing, hands at the wound, and in the weak starlight I saw pieces of tooth mixed with blood on his beard. I left the hatchet in him because there was no time to wrench it free. Others were close. I could hear them crashing through brush. I ran along the ravine edge until I found a place narrow enough to jump. I barely made it. My back foot slipped, sending rock into the dark below. But I landed chest first on the far side and kept crawling till I hit trees again. The terrain changed after that. Less brush, more open timber, and old skid roads from logging days. I used that. Cut left, then doubled back, then climbed toward a ridge line, hoping to lose them against the wind and dark. My lungs felt shredded. My shoulder was wet, not sure from the crawl space or the fight. Probably both. Twice I heard them whistle to each other. Once I heard one call out, "Bring the dog!" That scared me more than the guns. I moved faster. After what might have been 40 minutes or 4 hours, I saw a faint rectangle of light through the trees and
nearly cried from relief. Not headlights, fixed light, a building. I approached carefully because by then trust had become a luxury, but it turned out to be an old Forest Service workstation or maybe seasonal ranger hut. Half-boarded, mostly dark, one solar yard light glowing over the door. No truck outside, no people. But on the wall beside the door was a metal emergency radio box.
I tore it open so hard I bent the hinge. Inside was a handset and instructions for emergency county dispatch relay. I hit the call toggle and got nothing at first but static. Then a woman's voice, weak but real. I have never loved a stranger's voice like I loved that one. I told her my name, approximate location from the county map, armed men pursuing, homicide scene at a remote cabin, vehicle disabled, cabin on fire, need sheriff and fire response immediately. I said it all too fast and had to repeat half of it. She kept telling me to slow down, to breathe, to confirm, to stay on the line. Then she asked the question I still hear sometimes. "Sir, are you alone right now?" Before I could answer, something hit the outside wall of the station. Hard. I spun with the shotgun up and saw a face in the side window. Just for an instant. Pale, long-haired, smiling. The woman from the footage, I think. Then gone. I shouted into the radio that they were there. Dispatch told me units were coming from Siskiyou County, but it would take time. She asked if I could barricade. I could, barely. The station door had a deadbolt and a desk I shoved against it. The windows were reinforced plexi, except for the small side pane where I'd seen the face. I dragged shelving in front of that too. My hands shook so badly I dropped shells twice trying to reload. Outside, they gathered. I knew that because the noises stopped behaving like pursuit and started behaving like occupancy. Footsteps, circling, murmured voices. One laugh, one cough. Something metallic dragged over concrete. Then a man called through the door, polite as church. "You can still come out clean." No answer from me. "You stay in there and they find all that blood on you, all those shells, and a dead man with your hatchet in his mouth. What do you think that'll look like?" That hit because it wasn't stupid. I had blood all over me. I had fired inside a cabin now burning. I had killed or maimed at least one man in the woods. Then he added, almost kindly, "Walter picked you because you looked strong enough to make it look good." That sentence changed something in me. Until then, the situation had been terror and survival. With that sentence, it became personal. I realized then, this was not just some local feud where I'd wandered into the wrong property. Bell had not hired me in spite of the danger. The danger was the purpose. I don't know if they wanted a dead stranger in the ashes for insurance fraud, for some ritualized game, for a revenge setup, or for something even meaner and pettier. Maybe they needed an outsider's body. Maybe they wanted a believable story if authorities ever dug into the remains in the shed. Maybe they simply liked choosing. But I understood one thing with absolute clarity. I had not been unlucky. I had been selected. The pounding began around 15 minutes later, not on the door, under the building. At first, I thought it was imagination, or aftershock from the cabin fire echoing in my head. Then it came again, a hollow boom from beneath the floorboards near the back corner.
There was a crawl space under the ranger station, too. Of course there was. I backed away from that corner just as a hand pushed up through a warped floor vent and clawed at air. I fired straight down. The blast shattered the vent and filled the room with splinters. A scream came from under the station, followed by furious scrambling. Almost at once, the front window erupted, not broken through fully, but starred by a heavy impact. Then another. Then another. They had rocks, maybe tools. I had 4 shells left in the tube, 9 more in my pocket, and no guarantee the deputies were anywhere close. Then I saw the first flashing red-blue through the trees. Faint, far, but real. Outside, voices changed instantly. Less calm, faster. One shouted something I didn't catch, then running footsteps, more than one direction. I moved to the side window and risked a look. 3 figures cut through the trees downslope, vanishing into black timber. Another limped after them. One paused and turned back toward the station, and for a second the approaching patrol lights washed his face across the clearing. Burn-scarred cheek, big beard. The man from the trail camera. He stood there looking at me through the plexi, as if memorizing me. Then he smiled and ran. Deputies found me maybe 7 minutes later, though it felt much longer. They came in guns up, one shouting commands until dispatch confirmed I was the caller. I remember lowering the shotgun and realizing only then how close I was to passing out. The rest of that night came in pieces. Paramedics cleaning blood off my neck that wasn't mine. A deputy shining a light in my eyes. The smell of smoke on the wind from the burning cabin. The sheriff himself asking me 3 times if I was certain there were multiple suspects, because only one clear set of recent tracks had been found near one approach. That part pissed me off enough to keep me awake. By daylight, they found plenty. The cabin was mostly gone. Front half collapsed, roof dropped in, porch charred black. My truck was burned too. Somebody had torched it after I fled, probably for completeness. In the generator shed, they found the remains. Officially, partial human remains belonging to at least 2 individuals. Not 1, 2. One older male, one younger, based on preliminary assessment. Neither easy to identify because of mutilation, animal activity, and fire contamination nearby. In the kitchen wall, they found the hanging objects I'd seen, tooth included. Human, as it turned out. In the woods beyond the ravine, they found the man I'd hit with the hatchet, dead. The blade was still in his face, lodged between the teeth and cervical spine at an angle the coroner later said would have made speech impossible, even if the blood loss hadn't killed him first. His name, eventually, was not on any recent local registry. No valid ID, no prints in the system under anything current. But one deputy thought he recognized him from old calls involving a family that used to live scattered in illegal structures deeper in the timber back in the 90s. Trouble, disappearances, animal carcasses left hanging, then nothing for years. They never found Walter Bell. The name turned out to be fake. The phone was a prepaid burner, purchased 2 counties south and activated for less than a week. The cache had no useful prints. The map pin had none either. The brass key fit the front door, but locksmiths later said it had been copied from an older blank no longer sold in most stores. The trail cams were mine, in a way, because the sheriff's department took them as evidence, and I had to watch those videos again in interviews until I knew every frame. Here's the part that still bothers me most. On one of the last saved clips, taken the same afternoon I arrived, the camera nearest the road caught my truck entering the clearing. About 40 seconds before that, just visible at the edge of the frame, someone was already standing behind the generator shed, watching for me. Not walking into position, already there, waiting. The case dragged on for months, then years in a way. Intermittent leads, a cabin fire connected to a missing surveyor in Oregon, an abandoned camp near the Trinity Alps with human bones mixed into a burn pit, a witness in Klamath County who swore he'd met an old man in dark glasses trying to hire day labor under the table for remote repair work. Nothing solid enough, nothing that ended with cuffs. I gave statement after statement. The sheriff believed me eventually, I think, but belief isn't the same as answers. Law enforcement likes categories: trespass, homicide, arson, conspiracy. What happened up there touched all of them, and still somehow sat outside them. Too organized to be random, too primitive in places to be simple fraud, too deliberate not to have happened before. I quit cabin restoration the next spring. People assumed it was the trauma, and sure, that was part of it. But the truth is worse. It wasn't just fear. It was contamination. The job had been built around trust in remote places. Trust that an address was really an address, that a client wanted what he said he wanted, that solitude meant privacy instead of exposure. Once that trust goes, every rural job looks like bait. For a while, I did handyman work in town. Decks, water heaters, fence repair, stuff where if someone wanted to kill me, at least there'd be neighbors. Then, about 8 months after the fire, I came out to my apartment parking lot in Redding and found a small, white bakery box on the hood of my truck. No grease this time, no note on top. I stood there in the dawn light with my keys in my hand and couldn't move. Finally, I used a tire iron to open it from a distance. Inside was a single brass key on a plain ring. Same kind Belle had handed me in the diner. Beneath it sat something wrapped in wax paper. I didn't need to unwrap it to know. I called the police instead. They found the paper held a strip of dried meat, human origin undetermined due to treatment and contamination, though the detective quietly told me later he suspected otherwise. No prints, no camera coverage in that lot, no witnesses. A month later, I got a padded envelope with no return address. Inside was a burned memory card, half melted, but not all the way. The lab got one file off it, one still frame, not video, just a still. It showed the interior of the cabin's bedroom the night I'd first planned to sleep in my truck. Shot from the dark corner near the closet. My back was to the camera. I was bending over the mattress, unaware. Which means somebody had been inside that room with me. Maybe minutes before I left. Maybe longer. You can tell yourself a lot of comforting lies until you learn the hunt started before you even knew you were in it. I moved after that. Changed counties. Changed trucks. Stopped using my full name on any public business filings. Bought cameras for the outside of my house and motion lights, and a dog too big for most delivery people to approach comfortably. It helped some. Not enough. Because every now and then, usually in late fall when the air dries out and wood smoke carries farther than it should, something brings it back in full. A certain type of road, a certain type of porch. A diner where the old men at the counter all turn at once. A disconnected number. A trail cam nailed to a tree and pointed not at the world, but at whatever poor bastard thinks he's safe inside. People love to say the scariest monsters are human. That's true only in the most useless possible sense. Human explains nothing. Some people become systems, rituals, ways of feeding appetite to appetite until cruelty no longer even looks emotional. It just looks practical, efficient, passed down. That's what keeps me awake sometimes. The possibility that Belle and those others weren't improvising. That this wasn't a one-off insurance scheme or a random killing field. That there's a pattern to it. Maybe older than I want to know. Where isolated cabins become stages and outsiders become props. And one man in clean sunglasses and a baseball cap goes into a diner every few years to choose who disappears next. I think about the handshake a lot. How he held it. How he studied me, not like a client checking whether a contractor seemed competent, like a farmer thumping a melon, like a rancher looking over cattle, like a man deciding how much trouble a thing might be before it died. There's one more detail I never put in any formal statement, because by then I was tired of hearing silence on the other end of the table. When deputies searched the burned cabin ruins, they found something under what had been the front porch steps. A shallow space boxed in with old planks. Inside were odds and ends too scorched to inventory cleanly. Melted jars, hooks, coins, bits of bone. And one object mostly intact, a Polaroid. The image was heat-warped but readable. It showed the cabin at night, years before the fire, lit from within. Standing in the doorway was a man I'm almost certain was not Walter Bell. He was younger, broader, wearing suspenders and a flannel coat, one hand on the jamb. At his feet, on the porch boards, lay another man, on his back, with his throat open to the spine. And in the lower right corner of the frame, partly cut off, was a child's arm holding the edge of the photograph, as if the picture had been taken by someone older and then examined by someone young. On the back, in faded blue ink, one sentence had been written: "Don't pick one who runs too fast." That was the moment I stopped believing I had survived a plan. I started believing I had survived a tradition. I don't know where Belle is. I don't know how many of them are left. I don't know whether the woman at the ranger station window was family, partner, daughter, or simply another willing piece of the same rotten machinery. What I do know is this. 2 years ago, I was driving through a little town outside Medford on my way to a roofing estimate. I stopped at a truck stop diner for coffee around 6 in the morning, still dark outside, rain tapping the glass. A man in a cap and sunglasses came in and sat alone near the back wall. I only got a side view, could have been anyone, but when the waitress brought his coffee, he touched her wrist lightly and held it a second too long. Not flirtatious, not friendly. Measuring. She laughed awkwardly and stepped away. I left without finishing my coffee. Maybe I'm paranoid. Maybe trauma makes patterns where none exist. Maybe the remains in the shed, the cameras, the ear on the porch, the fire, the people in the trees, the photograph under the steps, all of it was one isolated burst of rural madness that happened to brush against my life. Once, and only once.
I'd love to believe that. But I still keep one thing from that night locked in a toolbox I never open, unless I need to remind myself not to be stupid. When I fought that man by the ravine, before the hatchet struck him, the chain wrapped around his hand whipped across my chest and snagged in my jacket zipper. When I tore free, a little object stayed tangled in the fabric. I didn't notice until later. It was a tiny brass tag, no bigger than a poker chip, with a hole punched through the top, as if it once hung from a key ring or animal collar. Stamped into the metal were 6 numbers. No letters, no name, just 6 numbers. At first, I thought it might be some kind of hunting license marker or inventory tag. Then, a detective from the sheriff's office went very quiet looking at it. He asked where I got it. I told him. He asked if I was sure. I said yes. He put it into an evidence bag himself and told me they'd follow up. They never did. A year later, after the case had gone stale and I'd stopped expecting calls, I ran into that same detective at a gas station in Red Bluff. He looked older, tired, like he'd been sleeping in a chair. I asked him what the tag was. He stared at the pump screen for a long time before answering. Finally, he said, "Livestock tags used to come in sets from a rendering company out of Oregon. Small operations, mostly private. Some families used them for homemade records." "What kind of records?" He looked at me then, and the way he looked at me made me wish I'd never asked. "The dead ones," he said. Then he got in his car and drove away. I stood there at the gas pump with rain needling my jacket and traffic hissing by on the road, thinking about that sentence until the numbers on the pump stopped making sense. The dead ones. That's what I was supposed to become in that cabin. Not just killed, counted, cataloged, stored. A solved problem in somebody else's old, practiced system. So yeah, I used to tell people I had one of the best jobs in Northern California. Fresh air, quiet nights, beautiful views, honest work. Now when anybody asks why I won't take remote jobs anymore, I just say I got tired of driving county roads after dark. That's close enough to the truth. The rest of it stays where most real horror stays. Half buried, badly documented, and waiting in places too lonely for anyone to hear you scream until the fire's already caught. Story 3. We let a wounded man into our cabin in Vermont. My girlfriend paid for it. I was 28 when it happened, old enough to think I was a serious man, young enough to still confuse good intentions with good judgment. Back then, I lived in western Massachusetts and sold industrial valves for a company nobody outside New England had ever heard of. It was steady money, dull work, and the kind of job that made you grateful for weekends because weekdays felt like they were happening to somebody else. I'd been dating a woman I'll call Nora for a little over 2 years. That wasn't her real name, but enough of the truth in this story still belongs to her, and I've spent too long carrying the guilt of it to drag her real one into public. Nora was the kind of woman who could make almost anything sound romantic. An off-season motel in Maine became charming. A freezing beach in November became melancholy in a good way. A used bookstore with a leaking roof became the kind of place cities don't deserve anymore. So when she suggested we rent a log cabin in Vermont for a long weekend in late October of 1989, I said yes before I even checked whether I could get the Monday off. The place was outside a small town west of Woodstock, down a county road that turned to packed dirt after a covered bridge,
and then narrowed into a rutted track lined with stone walls and old sugar maples. It wasn't wilderness, exactly, but it felt remote in the way New England backcountry often does. Not mile after mile of untouched forest like out west, more like old land gone quiet. Woods that had once been worked, fenced, farmed, walked, and then left to grow over their own history. We rented the cabin through a woman in town who kept the key in a coffee tin under the register of a general store that sold bait, postcards, maple candy, and shotgun shells.
She gave us one sheet of typed instructions with a local number for emergencies, directions to the nearest gas station, and a note that the phone at the cabin sometimes worked and sometimes didn't, depending on weather and line mood. That should have amused me more than it did. The day we drove out, the weather was cold and bright, one of those clear fall afternoons where every red barn and bare branch looks sharper than real life. Nora had packed enough sweaters for a month and brought a grocery bag full of paperbacks. I had a duffel, a case of beer, 2 packs of Marlboros, and the foolish confidence of a man going somewhere isolated with the woman he loves, and assuming isolation only ever means privacy. The cabin was better than the ad promised. Hand-hewn logs, pitched roof, a field stone chimney, a front porch with 2 rocking chairs, and a little stand of birch off to one side that flashed silver when the wind moved. There was a wood stove in the main room, a couch with heavy plaid cushions, a narrow kitchen, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub, and one bedroom tucked under the eaves. It smelled like pine boards, ash, cold iron, and old books. There were no other cabins in sight, no porch lights in the distance, no engine noise. Just wind and crows, and, once in a while, the popping sound of acorns hitting the roof. Nora loved it immediately. So did I. We unloaded the car, drove back into town for groceries we'd forgotten, ate burgers at a diner with 6 stools and a waitress who called us "you kids," and got back before dark with enough food and wine to stay holed up for days. On the way in, Nora said it felt like we'd stolen a little piece of another century. That night we built a fire, drank too much red wine, and made love on the rug in front of the stove like people in a catalog for rustic living. I'm telling you that because it matters that we were happy. Horror works best on happiness. It has more to tear. Saturday was ordinary in the best way. We woke late, made coffee, walked a trail behind the cabin that climbed through hemlock and maple to a low ridge where you could see layers of hills fading into blue. We found old stone foundation blocks in the woods, half swallowed by leaves, and Nora invented lives for the people who had lived there. We bought cider and cheddar in town. We came back before sunset because the temperature dropped fast once the light started going. Nothing about that day warned me. Nothing, except one thing so small I almost didn't remember it later. At the general store, while I paid for kindling, an old man in a red hunting cap asked the clerk whether the North Hollow place was occupied this weekend. The clerk said yes. A couple from Massachusetts had it. The old man looked at me, looked at Nora, and nodded once, like he'd just lost a private bet. Then he said, "Tell him not to answer if somebody comes knocking after dark." The clerk rolled her eyes and told him not to start. He laughed and said he was joking. Then he bought lamp oil and left. I forgot about that until much later. That second evening was when our real life ended, and the thing I still think of as the afterlife of it began.
We had dinner around 7. Pasta, cheap Chianti, bread toasted in a pan because the oven ran hot and smoked if you used it too long. Afterward, Nora curled up on the couch with a book, while I flipped through a stack of old field guides someone had left on a shelf by the fireplace. Around 9, the wind picked up. The windows rattled in their frames. Branches scraped the roof and walls. The wood stove made the whole place warm enough that stepping into the kitchen felt like entering another season. I remember feeling deeply, stupidly content. The radio on the counter only caught one station through the static, some low college frequency out of Burlington maybe. Folk music, weather, then a stretch of dead air.
I got up to adjust the antenna, and that was when we heard the first sound from outside. A voice, not loud, just enough to cut across the radio hiss and the stove tick. Nora looked up from her book. "Did you hear that?" Before I could answer, somebody knocked on the front door. 3 hard knocks. Not random, deliberate. It startled both of us badly enough that Nora actually gasped. The clock on the mantel said 9:17. I stood, more annoyed than afraid at first. My assumption was car trouble, maybe a hunter, maybe someone from town with some issue related to the rental. The nearest house might have been a mile or more away, but people knock on rural doors. It happens. Then came another knock, louder this time, and a man's voice said, "Please, please open up." Something in the tone changed the room immediately. He sounded hurt, not theatrical hurt, not a yell. He sounded thin and breathless, like he was trying not to collapse while speaking. Nora whispered, "Don't." I moved toward the door anyway, but slowly. "Who is it?" The answer came after a beat. "Please, I've been cut. I need help." I stopped with my hand halfway to the latch. Nora got off the couch. No, don't open it." There are moments when decency and danger look too much alike. That was one of them. I asked through the door, "What happened?" "Please," he said again, "they're looking for me." Those words went through me colder than the weather outside. Nora shook her head violently. "Call someone." "We don't know if the phone even works," I said. "Then don't open the door." I wish now I had listened. I wish I had been a little crueler, a little less eager to believe my own usefulness. Instead, I did what men like to do when they want to think of themselves as protectors. I split the difference in the dumbest possible way. I went to the side window first and pulled one curtain edge back just enough to see the porch. A man stood there, leaning against one of the posts. Late 30s, maybe 40. Heavy canvas coat, knit cap, beard stubble, one hand clamped over his left side. The porch light caught what looked like wet blackness spread across the front of his jacket. Blood, a lot of it. He saw the curtain move and looked straight at me with an expression so nakedly frightened it overrode the last of my caution. "Please," he said, "don't leave me out here." I opened the door. He stumbled in fast enough that I had to catch him by the shoulder to keep him from going face first on the rug. He smelled like wet leaves, sweat, and something metallic and sharp. Blood, yes, but not only blood. There was an undersmell to him, a chemical sweetness I couldn't place then. Nora backed up toward the kitchen, pale and rigid. The man bent double near the stove, breathing in quick, ugly pulls, and said, "Lock it, Please lock it." I shut the door and threw the bolt. "Sit down," I said. "Let me see." He let me guide him toward the couch. His hand came away from his side, and I saw the blood more clearly. His coat and flannel shirt had a slit torn through them, and beneath that, something dark gleamed wetly. Nora said, "Oh my God." I asked if he'd been stabbed. He nodded. "By who?" "Two men," he swallowed. "Rode. I ran." There are details about him I remember with impossible clarity now, because trauma turns observation cruelly bright. Dirt under his nails, a chipped incisor, one bootlace frayed almost through. His eyes not the blue I first thought, but gray with little yellow flecks around the pupil. A tiny white scar at the corner of his mouth. What I don't remember is ever hearing him say his name. If he did, I lost it. If he didn't, that matters. I told Nora to get towels. She didn't move at first. Then she did, stiffly, like her body had to be reminded it belonged to her. I helped the man ease off his coat. The blood was real, no question. But something about the wound was odd even then. It didn't soak and pulse the way I expected from a fresh stab. It looked more smeared than flowing, concentrated around a slit in the shirt and then dragged wider by his own hand. I thought maybe the fabric was hiding how deep it was. When Nora came back with dish towels, I told him we needed to take him to a hospital. He shook his head too quickly. "No roads," he said. "They'll be watching the road." Then we call the sheriff. No phone. "You know that?" He looked up at me. That was the first true wrongness. Not because he knew, because of how quickly the answer came. As if he'd expected the question. "It was out when I tried before," he said. "Tried where?" He hesitated just a fraction too long. "At another place." Nora caught that too. I could tell by the way she looked at me. Still, I wanted this to make sense. I wanted it so badly I kept feeding it explanations. Shock, blood loss, confusion. Maybe he'd already tried another cabin and found no phone. Maybe the line was dead all over the road. I told Nora to check the phone anyway. She went into the kitchen. The man watched her go. That bothered me more than the answer she came back with a few seconds later. Dead line. Just silence. I said I'd drive into town. He grabbed my wrist, hard. Hard enough that I looked down in surprise. "Don't leave the lights on," he said. His grip felt wrong. Too strong. Too certain. I peeled his fingers off me. "If you want help, I need to get it." He stared at my face for a second, then released me and looked down again, almost sheepish. Sorry. They'll see." Nora pulled me aside near the kitchen doorway and hissed, "Don't go." "What do you want me to do? Let him bleed out?" "I don't know what I want you to do. I want you not to leave me here with him." I looked back at the man. He had one hand against the wound again, breathing hard, head bowed. The Christian thing, the decent thing, the ordinary American thing to do in 1989 if a man bled onto your cabin floor in the middle of nowhere was to get help. So I made the compromise I thought was responsible. I would move the car right up to the porch, get him loaded in the back seat, and all three of us would drive into town together.
If the car got down the dirt road, great. If not, at least we'd all be together and moving. I grabbed my keys and jacket. Nora said my name in a voice I still hear sometimes when I wake too fast. I kissed her, told her to stay with him, and went outside. The cold hit like a slap. Porch light, black woods, my own breath smoking. Nothing moved. The car sat where I'd left it, beside the side yard, maybe 30 yards from the porch. I jogged to it, got in, turned the key. Nothing. Not even a cough. I tried again. Silence. A pure, blank silence, so sudden and complete, it almost felt electrical.
I swore, popped the hood, and got out with a flashlight from the glove box. The battery cable had been cut. Clean through. I stared at it maybe 3 seconds before the part of me that still wanted to be reasonable finally started dying. When I lifted the flashlight beam, I saw something else on the ground beneath the bumper. A strip of black electrical tape. A pair of diagonal pliers. And next to them, impressed in the dirt, 2 boot prints that were not mine. Fresh. Very fresh. I ran back to the cabin. I don't mean I moved quickly. I mean I ran full out, lungs burning, flashlight swinging. The front door was open, not wide, maybe 1.5 feet, just enough for warm firelight to spill across the porch. I remember making a sound then. Not a word, something animal and raw in my throat. I hit the doorway so hard my shoulder rang. The main room looked empty at first glance. Then I saw blood. Not just the smears from the man's coat, a lot more. On the rug, across the couch, spattered up one log wall. Nora was not in the room. The man was not in the room. I shouted her name and charged into the bedroom. She was on the floor beside the bed, still alive. That is the only mercy in this story. She had been beaten so badly I didn't recognize her for half a second. One eye swollen shut, blood from her nose and mouth, her blouse torn open, bruises already rising dark on her throat in the shape of fingers. One side of her face had a shoe print across it in mud and blood. She was trying to curl in on herself and couldn't. I dropped to my knees and touched her shoulder. She flinched, like I had burned her. That flinch broke something in me I've never fixed. "Where is he?" I asked. "Where is he?" She couldn't answer. She made a broken sound and tried to point. The bathroom. I stood up and went there fast enough to slip on the floorboards. He was gone. The bathroom window was open, not wide enough for comfort, but wide enough for a determined man. Mud on the sill, blood on the frame, maybe from his coat, maybe from somewhere else. He had used us to get inside, waited until I left, and then he had done what he came there to do. I went back to Nora. I don't know how long passed before headlights hit the trees outside. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30. It felt both instant and endless. The lights belonged to a farmer from town and his grown son. I had seen them only once before in the diner, but word travels fast in places like that, and when I came pounding on the general store owner's brother's house, half out of my mind, screaming that a man had attacked my girlfriend, they didn't waste time asking for every detail. One called the sheriff from a wall phone, while the other grabbed his truck keys and a shotgun. I barely remember the drive back, except for begging them to hurry, and then, once we got there, begging them not to come in too fast in case the man was still inside. He wasn't. He had left us with the damage and gone. The sheriff arrived maybe 25 minutes after that, from Windsor County, bulky tan coat, revolver low on his belt, tired eyes that sharpened immediately when he saw the blood. The local ambulance took Nora first to a small hospital, then later to a larger one. I rode in the front because there wasn't room in back and because one of the EMTs told me I was in the way. That was the beginning of the long part, the part that lasts. At the hospital, they cleaned blood off my hands that wasn't mine and sat me under fluorescent lights while a deputy took my first statement. Then another. Then the sheriff himself. Then a state police detective, because sexual assault had entered the picture, whether anyone wanted to say the word out loud or not. The man, I told them, was white, 40-ish, medium build, dirty jacket, knit cap, maybe 5'10", gray or light eyes, strong, smelled strange. Claimed he'd been stabbed, asked us to lock the door, knew the phone was dead. When I mentioned the battery cable, the sheriff looked at me for a long moment and said, so he'd already been at the car before he ever knocked. Yes, I said. He wrote something down. Later, much later, I understood that line was the true start of the crime. Not the knock, not the act. The car. He made sure we were trapped before we ever had the chance to decide whether to be kind. Nora didn't speak coherently until the next day. When she did, I wanted to hear and did not want to hear it with equal force. After I left, she said, the man on the couch watched the door for maybe 10 seconds. Then he stood up straight. No groan, no stagger, no sign of injury at all. He walked to the kitchen, took the towel off his side, and threw it in the sink. Then he smiled at her. Not wide. Just enough. She told him not to come any closer. He asked if she thought I would make it back before he was done. Then he hit her, hard enough to knock her into the coffee table. She tried to run for the bedroom because that was where I had told her to go if anything felt wrong. He caught her by the hair before she made it through the doorway. She clawed him. He liked that. She knew he liked it, she said, because he laughed. I'm not going to detail everything he did. Some things belong to the dead, and the living they ruined, not to listeners. What matters is this. The wound was fake. The blood was mostly animal blood, probably pig or deer, mixed with enough of his own or somebody's to smell real. The slit in the coat had been prepared in advance. The fear in his eyes on the porch had not been fear. It had been anticipation. He had not come there in panic. He had come there ready. The sheriff's department found more proof of that before noon. About 100 yards from the cabin, behind a stand of spruce near the dirt road, they found where he had hidden before approaching the door. Cigarette butts, a thermos, candy wrappers, a roll of electrical tape matching the strip by my car, a butcher knife with dried animal blood on it and tufts of gray hog hair stuck to the handle. And tied to a low branch with twine, almost like he didn't care if anyone found it later, was an old army surplus canteen, half full of stage blood, or something close enough to it, corn syrup, dye, and more blood. He had set the whole thing before we ever heard the knock. That knowledge didn't make me feel smarter for figuring it out after the fact. It made me feel like prey. The next 3 days blurred into interviews, hospital corridors, and the beginning of the special kind of hatred people reserve for themselves when they know
exactly where the trap closed.
The sheriff, to his credit, moved quickly. Roadblocks, interviews in town, questions at gas stations and diners along state routes. They canvassed hunting camps and checked recent prison releases with violent assault histories in Vermont and New Hampshire. They dusted the cabin. They cast prints from the mud below the bathroom window. They collected fibers, hair, blood, and a partial palm print from the sink where he'd thrown the towel. They also found something I had missed entirely in the panic that first night. Under the front porch, tucked between the stone supports, they found a paper grocery bag. Inside were women's items: a torn blouse, a broken barrette, a tube of lipstick, a motel key fob from New Hampshire, a photograph of a woman smiling by a lake, and beneath all that, wrapped in newspaper, a section of human finger with the nail painted dark red. The sheriff didn't tell me that himself. I overheard it from two deputies who thought I was asleep in a hospital chair. One said, "Jesus Christ," and the other said, "This ain't his first." They were right. 4 days later, they identified him. I won't use the real name because, unlike Nora, he deserves erasure wherever possible. I'll call him Alan Mercer. He was 39, from nowhere and everywhere the way some predators are. Temporary jobs, boarding houses, aliases, short stints in county jails, a military record that ended before it ought to have, a juvenile history sealed in one state and bleeding into rumors in two others. Assaults that had collapsed for lack of witnesses. A waitress in New Hampshire who never came back from a night shift. A divorced woman in upstate New York who survived an attack by a man claiming car trouble outside her farmhouse. A motel maid in Maine found with facial fractures and signs of sexual assault after letting a guest back into a room he no longer rented. Same pattern, once you knew how to look. Injury, need, urgency, isolation. He was a man who weaponized the American reflex to help. They caught him 11 days after the attack in a motor lodge outside Rutland. Not because of genius police work, though there was some of that. Because men like him eventually get hungry, or careless, or lonely enough to approach civilization again. A desk clerk recognized his photo from a BOLO and called it in after Mercer paid cash for one night and asked whether the motel's phone lines ever acted funny in weather. He had a different beard by then, shaved short, different jacket, different story ready if anyone asked, but he still had a little scar at the corner of his mouth and one gray eye with a yellow fleck near the pupil. They found a duffel in his room with cut phone cord, tape, a wig, women's jewelry, newspaper clippings, and a bottle of theatrical blood. They also found a Polaroid camera. Most of the film was undeveloped. The sheriff asked if I wanted to know whether there were photos from our cabin on it. I said no. Then yes. Then no again. In the end, the prosecutor handled it. I learned only what I had to learn for trial, and tried not to imagine the rest. Nora survived, but survived is such a dishonest word sometimes. It sounds like conclusion. It means continuation. Her jaw had been fractured in 2 places, 3 ribs cracked, 1 wrist sprained trying to fight him off. Bruising everywhere, cuts inside her mouth from where her teeth had driven into her cheek. The rest of her injuries were the kind doctors describe clinically, and loved ones hear with a roaring in their ears. She couldn't sleep without medication for months, then couldn't sleep with it without nightmares. She jumped at men's voices in grocery stores, couldn't tolerate being home alone after sunset,
hated closed curtains because the cabin had curtains, hated open curtains because then somebody could see in.
Sometimes she wanted every light on. Sometimes she wanted none. And me, well, I got a special punishment too. I was the one who opened the door. I was the one who left. I was the one who thought in terms of practical solutions while she was already smelling danger. Nora never said those exact words to me. She didn't have to. Grief and blame can live in the same room without speaking. I testified at Mercer's trial 6 months later. So did Nora, though I still don't know how she managed it. Strength is too soft a word for what she had to do. She sat there in a blue jacket with her hands folded so tightly in her lap the knuckles looked polished. Mercer watched her with that same almost curious expression he'd had in the booking photo, like violence was just a conversation he was better at than other people. The prosecutor laid out the pattern, the fake wound, the disabled car, the hidden kit near the tree line, prior victims, physical evidence from the cabin, fibers from his coat on Nora's blouse, her skin under his nails, his palm print in the sink, blood on his gear, the bag beneath the porch with items connected to at least 2 other open cases. He got life. Good. And still it wasn't enough, because justice is a transaction, and horror is debt. People think conviction closes a story. It does not. It only stops one man from adding to it. Nora and I lasted another year, maybe a little less, depending on when you think relationships really end. On the day the love changes shape, on the day the apartment gets too quiet, or on the day one person says out loud what both have known for months. We tried. God knows we tried. I moved with her into a new place closer to Boston because she wanted noise outside the windows and neighbors on both sides. I learned where every light switch was in that apartment and checked the locks twice each night and kept a baseball bat beside the bed like a cartoon of vigilance. If she woke screaming, I was there. If she froze in a parking lot because a man in a work jacket looked wrong from behind, I was there. If she couldn't shower with the bathroom door fully closed, I sat outside and read a magazine so she could hear pages turning. But I was also evidence, a reminder with a pulse. She told me that one rainy Sunday in April, while we sat in a parked car outside a grocery store because she couldn't make herself go in, she said, "I know you didn't mean it." Then she said, "That doesn't help when I look at you." That sentence hurt more honestly than any accusation could have. We didn't split in one dramatic moment. We eroded. A weekend apart became another. Then different leases. Then Christmas cards. Then no cards. The kind of ending people call mutual, because naming the real cause feels obscene in public. I heard, through one mutual friend and then no one, that she eventually moved farther north, married late maybe, or maybe not, and taught art classes. I hope that part is true. I hope she had whole years untouched by what happened. As for me, I changed too, though in smaller, meaner ways. I stopped opening doors after dark unless I knew exactly who was on the other side. I stopped believing injury automatically deserved access. I stopped enjoying cabins, inns, anything sold as secluded or cozy. In motel rooms, I checked under beds and behind shower curtains long past the point of reason.
On road trips, I refueled before dusk because I never wanted to need anything from strangers at night. If I saw a stalled car on a back road, I called it in from the next gas station instead of stopping. That's the kind of thing people judge until they've had one night peel civilization off the world and show them the machinery underneath.
You want the worst part? It isn't that a bad man knocked and we let him in. It's that sometimes, even now, almost 4 decades later, part of me still sees that porch image in my head. The cold, the blood, the fear in his face, and understands exactly why I opened the door. That part of me is still human. That's what makes the rest unbearable. There's one detail I never told the police because at the time it felt too strange, too small, too impossible to matter. I'm not sure why I'm telling it now, except that secrets rot if you hold them long enough. When I came back from the car and found the cabin door open, before I saw Nora in the bedroom, I noticed something on the floor just inside the threshold. An acorn. Whole, wet, mud on one side. It shouldn't have meant anything, except earlier that day, out on the ridge trail, Nora had found an acorn cap, shaped like a little hat, and balanced it on my thumb, joking that forest things leave signs if they like you. I had laughed and put an acorn from the trail into my jacket pocket to throw at her later. I forgot to. That same acorn was still in my pocket when the sheriff took my clothes for evidence at the hospital. So the acorn inside the doorway was not mine. It had been placed there by Mercer, or knocked in on his boot, or brought by chance on the cuff of his jeans. None of those explanations should matter, but in my memory, that acorn became a kind of hinge. One natural thing from outside crossing the threshold before the violence. A piece of the woods entering the room with him, as if the dark beyond the porch had sent in a scout. Trauma gives ordinary objects ugly jobs. For years, I couldn't see an acorn on pavement without feeling my lungs tighten. The story should end there. It almost does. But there's one last thing, and this is the part that finally pushed me into telling it at all. In 2007, almost 18 years after the attack, I was driving through Vermont for work. Different life by then. Different company. I sold industrial filtration systems instead of valves, which I suppose is just a more complicated way of saying I still made money helping water go where people wanted it to. Late afternoon rain had turned to sleet, and I decided not to push on to Albany. I stopped in White River Junction, got a room at a motel off the interstate, and walked across the road to a diner for meatloaf and bad coffee. At the counter, 2 seats down, sat a Windsor County Sheriff's deputy. Older now, thick around the neck, chewing pie with the concentration of a man who didn't get many peaceful meals. I recognized him after a minute. He had been one of the first at the cabin. I introduced myself. He stared, then snapped his fingers. Massachusetts cabin case. That's what it was to him. A case. Fair enough. We talked. Small stuff first. Careers, weather, how the state had changed. Then eventually, because the past is a dog that always finds your heel if you stand still long enough, we got around to Mercer. The deputy said Mercer had died in prison 3 years earlier, after being beaten in the shower block with a padlock in a sock. I said I hoped it hurt. He said it probably did. Then he looked at his pie for a while and said, "You know what always bothered me about that fella? I assumed he meant the pattern, the staging, the cruelty. He shook his head. No, the cabin wasn't first. I said I thought the prosecution linked him to older cases. They did, but I mean that cabin specifically. He'd been there before. I felt cold all at once. How do you know? He took a sip of coffee. After the trial, we went back through old reports. Couple previous renters of that place made complaints over the years. Weird noises. Things moved. Somebody knocking around the porch at night. Nothing enough to open a major file. One woman thought she saw a face at the side window, and then changed her story next day, said it was only branches. But the one I kept thinking about was from '86. He set down the mug. Family from Jersey. Husband, wife, little boy. Came home early because the husband says someone had tried the car while they were inside one night. Found fingerprints on the windshield and driver's side. Sheriff then figured drunk local kids. Family never rented there again. I said nothing. He watched my face and added, quieter, Mercer was working odd jobs around Woodstock in '86 under another name. The room seemed to tilt slightly. You think he was scouting? The deputy shrugged. I think some men get attached to places that work for him. That sentence followed me out of the diner, across the motel parking lot, and into every bad dream I'd had since. Attached to places that work for him. Not just a predator with favored ground. I did something that night I had avoided for 18 years. I drove back toward that road. I don't know why. Guilt, maybe. Age. The false courage of a grown man who thinks time itself is armor. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself the place had shrunk, that memory had exaggerated it, that cabins are just wood and nails once enough seasons pass. The road was plowed now, better maintained than I remembered. The covered bridge was still there. The general store had become a gift shop with artisanal jam and candles in the window. Snow mist moved under the headlights as I turned onto the dirt lane. The cabin was gone, or mostly gone. Fire had taken it years after what happened to us. I knew that vaguely from county tax records I'd once looked up during a sleepless spell, but seeing it in person was different. Only the chimney remained standing, fieldstone blackened by soot and weather. Part of the foundation, charred sill beams sunk in wet leaves, birch trees thicker now around the edges, as if the land had been trying to close the wound. I parked on the road and stood there in sleet, listening to the hush of winter woods. No porch, no light, no door to knock on, just absence. I should have left after a minute. Instead, I walked up the path that used to lead to the front step. The stones of the old walkway still showed through the leaves. My flashlight moved over them, over the cracked line of foundation, over the place where the bedroom would have been. I don't know what I was looking for, maybe nothing. Then the beam caught something pale at the base of the chimney. At first I thought it was a deer skull. It was not. It was a face-shaped thing, half buried in leaves and ash. I crouched. Not a real face, not quite. A Halloween mask. Old latex, cracked and collapsing, one eye socket torn out, the molded mouth frozen open in a theatrical scream. Mud and leaf mold filled the nose. The backstrap had rotted away. Someone had tucked it there, deliberately, among the ruins. Beneath it lay a rusted coffee tin, the same kind the general store owner used to keep the key in. I stared at that tin until my scalp prickled. Then something knocked from inside the chimney, a single hard clack of stone on stone. I jerked backwards so violently I almost fell. My flashlight beam jumped, skated up the black throat of the chimney. Found nothing. Silence. Then another knock. Higher this time, closer to the top. I told myself a loosened rock, a branch, sleet shifting something in the flue remains. I told myself that even as I backed away. Then, from the woods to my right, a man coughed. Not loudly, just once. Human. Close. I ran for the car. I am not ashamed of that. At my age, I was not going into snowy timber at dusk to investigate a cough beside the ruins of a place where my life had broken. I slipped twice, hit the driver's door, got inside, locked it, and sat gasping with my own light glaring back off the windshield. Nothing moved at the tree line. No figure stepped out. No headlights approached. After maybe 30 seconds, maybe a year, I put the car in reverse. As the wheels turned, the headlights swung across the ruins one last time. In that brief sweep of light, I saw something hanging from the broken chimney stones. Not there before, or not visible before. A strip of dark cloth, and on it, pinned with a little silver safety pin, was an acorn cap. I drove. I drove too fast on icy roads and nearly put myself into a ditch twice before I hit pavement. At the motel, I locked the door, shoved a chair under the knob like a fool in a bad movie, and stayed awake all night with the TV on mute. The next morning, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the cloth and the acorn cap. Sleet, nerves, old memory making patterns. Then I found something on my windshield under the wiper. One whole acorn. Wet, clean, freshly placed. There were no oak trees anywhere near that motel parking lot. Make of that what you want. I never went back. So when people tell me now that the world is mostly good, I nod because I know what they mean. It is mostly good. Most knocks at the door are harmless. Most stranded drivers are stranded. Most people asking for help need it. Most men bleeding on a porch are not carrying a trap inside them. But most is weak comfort if you've met the exception up close. The exception changes the shape of everything around it. I still think about what Nora said that first minute when he knocked. Don't. One word. Clear, instinctive, free of ego. She knew danger before I allowed myself to. And maybe that's the ugliest lesson buried in this whole story. That evil often gets in because it understands goodness better than goodness understands evil. Mercer knew exactly what image would open that door. Fear. Blood. Vulnerability. The oldest bait there is. He dressed himself in need because decent people lower their guard for the wounded. That's why I tell this story now, if telling is what this is. Not for revenge, the man is dead. Not for pity, I had the lighter sentence. Not even for warning, because warnings rarely arrive before the knock. I tell it because sometimes horror is not a shadow in the woods or a thing under the floorboards. Sometimes it is a human face under a porch light, asking politely to be let in. And the worst part, the part that never leaves, is knowing that if I could go back to that exact second, see him there again, blood on his coat, voice trembling, eyes desperate, I honestly do not know for certain that I would choose differently. That uncertainty is its own life sentence.